Today we continue our Advent sermons on joy. 2 weeks ago we talked about the prophets and how they were foretelling the destruction of Jerusalem and gave this promise that there would be joy afterward. Joy after the pain, joy after the adversity. And then last week we turned our attention to Mary and we talked about how she was able to find joy as she lifted up the lowly and humbled the proud. Now today our Advent gaze goes towards Joseph. And we get to see through him and learn about joy through him. You know, today as I was thinking about joy for this message, I was thinking about a song that comes from the great theologian Garth Brooks. You know, he had quite a year last year. Went on tour. 6.4 million people saw him in concert. That was more than any American in concert to date. He had a book that shot to #1. He released his 20th #1 single. But it was back in 1990 that he wrote something that truly stuck out to me. He and his wife go to his hometown to watch a football game. Imagine Garth Brooks showing up for a football game at Owasso, Oklahoma, and he runs into his old flame. And in response to after he introduced his wife to his old girlfriend, he wrote this. She was the one that I wanted for all times, and each night I'd spend praying that God would make her mine. And if he'd only grant me this wish, I wished back then I'd never ask for anything again. I've asked Lois to come up and strum on the guitar the refrain of "Sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers." And if you know this song, would you sing it with us?
Please.
Together. Please.
I can't get my G here. Here we go. Sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers. Remember when you're talking to the man upstairs, that just because he may not answer doesn't mean he don't care. Some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered. Some of God's greatest gifts are too often unanswered. Some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered prayers.
Thank you. Garth Brooks in the form of Lois. I wonder, have you ever had answered prayers that today you thank God for? You prayed for a relationship to work out. You prayed for a job that you really wanted, but when you look back, you thank God that you didn't go down that path. It happened to Joseph. Now, we don't know a lot about Joseph, but we can gain a glimpse from him by looking at the first 2 chapters of Matthew and Luke. And when you're looking back, when you see in those chapters, you see that he had a lot of sorrow, a lot of heartbreak, and a lot of pain, but later he experienced joy. Now, he was able to look back at all of these experiences and say, I thank God for that, because if that would have happened, I wouldn't be here today. So today we're going to focus our attention on the joy we can't yet see. Because when we're walking in sorrow and brokenness and pain, we can't yet see joy. But we can come to trust that somehow after these experiences there will be joy. So let's first take a look at a passage, one of our stories that we do know about Joseph, and this one comes from the book of Matthew. Bruce.
I'm reading today from the first chapter of Matthew, starting with the 18th verse through the 24th verse. And I'm reading from the Good News Bible. His mother Mary was engaged to Joseph, but before they were married, she found out that she was going to have a baby by the Holy Spirit. Joseph was a man who always did what was right, but he did not want to disgrace Mary publicly, so he made plans to break the engagement privately. While he was thinking about this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, descendant of David, do not be afraid to take Mary to be your wife, for it is by the Holy Spirit that she has conceived. She will have a son, and you will name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." Now all this happened in order to make come true what the Lord had said through the prophet. "A virgin will become pregnant and have a son, and he will be called Emmanuel," which means God is with us. So when Joseph woke up, he married Mary as the angel of the Lord had told him to, but he had no sexual relations with her before she gave birth to her son, and Joseph named him Jesus.
Thank you, Bruce. As we learned last week, Mary plays this vital role in the plan of God to usher in this new kingdom. And so what we're going to find out today is that Joseph plays only second to the role that Mary did. Now, as I said, we don't know too much about Joseph, but we can use our imaginations a bit. And I have some assumptions here. My assumption is that Joseph was a pretty good dad. I believe that he was a pretty good dad because God chose Joseph to raise Jesus. And so here in a few moments, we're going to be thinking about those attributes of what Joseph was like as a good dad and share them a bit. So I would like you to take just a moment and think in your head of those attributes of Joseph as a dad. Just a few moments here. Now, on the count of 3, I want you to shout out your number 1 attribute of Joseph as the father of Jesus. All right? 1, 2, 3.
Patience.
Exactly. That's what was on my list too. So. Now, since I couldn't quite hear everybody out there, I'll give you my list. Loving, compassionate, merciful, man of character, appropriate use of discipline, kind, a teacher. I'm guessing that was probably on your list as well. Now, here is why I believe Joseph was a good dad. And it's based on the words of Jesus, specifically the one word that he uses to describe God. In fact, you say it at least every week. If you look at the Lord's Prayer, you find it right there. The Lord's Prayer was originally spoken in Aramaic, and when we say our Father, the word in Aramaic is Abba, A-B-B-A. And Abba refers to something, a very intimate relationship. It's almost akin to like a little child looking up at their dad and saying, Daddy. So literally, we should say at the beginning of the Lord's Prayer, Daddy in heaven. That one word conjures up this image of Jesus of a very intimate relationship. Adam Hamilton writes a book about Joseph, and he comes across in his research about Joseph this rhythm of sorrow and joy. And he finds this in a Catholic devotional work that is called The 7 Sorrows and Joys of St. Joseph. And these contain liturgies and prayers and pictures and icons of the 7 segments of his life. And what we're going to notice here is that each segment comes with a corresponding joy. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through these 7 segments of his life, because what we find is that in this wonderful study, we find our own rhythm of life. That in our journey, we all experience these sorrows and joy. It's just part of the seasons of life. We have sorrows punctuated with joy. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the pictures that comes from the Catholic and the Orthodox traditions as to how they walk through these 7 sorrows and joys of St. Joseph. The first one is called the broken heart. Mary is pledged to Joseph to be married. And now in the Bible, once one is engaged to be married, once one is engaged, they are now legally married. And if you break off that engagement, it is considered a divorce. And in our story, what do we find? Mary tells Joseph that she is pregnant. And the child is not his. Now, if you're Joseph, and Mary has just told you that an angel said that the baby is God's, well, if I'm Joseph, I'm probably not going to believe it. I'm probably going to prepare for a divorce. If I'm in his shoes, I'm pretty sure that I'm feeling heartbroken, pain, agony, and then probably some anger. And I certainly wouldn't believe her story. Now, I think any woman, any man who has ever felt betrayed in a relationship knows this heartbreak. Now, I want you to notice something about the scripture passage here. It does not tell us how long the period is between the time Joseph says he's going to dismiss Mary and the appearance of the angel. During that whole time, he is feeling heartbroken and sorrow. And this all takes place at the very beginning of the story. Joseph is feeling betrayed, and he is preparing for divorce. Now, we know the rest of the story, but sometimes we forget this first part and how doubt crept into the lives of Mary and Joseph. Now, think about this. Mary is sitting there telling him the story of how an angel told her that she is pregnant by God, and Joseph, as it says, is being a good and righteous man. He doesn't believe her. Imagine that. And it takes a dream to convince him. So we start with sorrow, and then we end with joy. An angel comes to convince him that, yes, this is all part of God's plan. Yes, there's no deception. There is no cheating. God is in control. It was a joy that he couldn't quite see, yet it was to come. The second sorrow takes place on the night that Jesus was born. They traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and all of Joseph's family is there for the census. Literally, there is no room. Now, the story is told about how Jesus was born in a barn and in a stable, sort of. Today, if you go to Bethlehem, you find these homes that are built right above a cave. And below, what you find is this is where the shepherds bring their animals to keep them safe and warm and fed at night. Now, imagine all of Joseph's family has come into Bethlehem for the census, and when it says there's no room, literally there's no room. Except where the animals are kept down below. Well, at least it's warm. So sorrow comes from the fact that Joseph can't even provide a proper place for his pregnant wife. And so what does she do? We know the story. She gives birth amongst animals and straw, and a crib literally is a feeding trough. Can you feel the sorrow? Now for me, it would crush me if Sarah had to give birth in those conditions. The sorrow comes from the fact that Joseph is poor. If he had means, he would have found a nicer place. Jesus is born into poverty. But that's a lesson for Christmas Eve. For Joseph, the sorrow felt was that he couldn't provide a place like other fathers could. What Joseph couldn't see was the joy of the three wise men who brought gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Only he could see was just his current sorrow. The third sorrow takes place when Joseph takes Jesus to be circumcised. Now, by Jewish tradition, it takes place on the 8th day after a boy's birth. And there is to be no anesthesia. Pain is part of the process. Even today, anesthesia is not to be used. And strict Jewish tradition says the father presents the child, not the mother. The father knows that by presenting his son to be hurt, he will bleed. And it will not be pleasant. Eli Jesner is a psychotherapist with a degree from Harvard. Dr. Jesner is also an Orthodox Jew. When his third son was being circumcised, he described his inner thoughts. I'm in the shower at 6 a.m. with a sick feeling in my gut. Today, my 8-day-old son is going to be circumcised. It feels really alien to choose pain upon my son, to put him through the trauma of a minor procedure without anesthesia. Just call it off. Just stop the whole thing. I find myself thinking. I put him on the chair and the prayers begin, and there is blood and there is screaming. I still feel sick as everyone comes to wish me mazel tov. I can't help it but to let them know that I am not happy about it, and I'm seriously shaken up by what just happened. And I never thought of that perspective before. This is the third sorrow. And right after this experience, tradition says that the father gets to name the child. And Joseph says his name is Jesus. That's what the angel told me. And his name will mean God will save. So there is joy, but Joseph doesn't understand it at the time. The baby is bleeding on the circumcision table, and yet 30 years later he will also bleed as a sign of something very different. Obviously, Joseph couldn't see this joy in the midst of the sorrow and of the blood, but it would be the role that would bring joy to the world. Fourth sorrow. Mary and Joseph bring Jesus to be dedicated at the temple. Now, this is not the circumcision. This takes place on the 40th day of the birth of a son, and the son is presented as a gift in the temple. And what is required is a sacrifice. And the scripture is very specific. It's supposed to be a lamb as a thank offering. But if you're too poor, like Joseph was, you can bring 2 pigeons. And so that's what Joseph does. And everything appears joyous, and in comes Simeon. He's a prophet, and he sees Jesus, and he says, this child, there will be tragedy in his life. And then he looks at Mary and Joseph, and he says, there will be a sword that will pierce your soul. Now, can you imagine bringing your child in for baptism right here? And it's a joyous event. You're bringing your son, your daughter up, and a longtime member of the congregation stands up and says, your child will know sorrow and tragedy in his life, and you will echo his pain. I imagine that happy event of yours would now be filled with sorrow. I pray that this never happens to you, but it happened to Mary and Joseph. But joy, Simeon says. He looks at Jesus, he says, he will be the light to the nations. It was joy that Joseph just quite couldn't see yet. The 5th sorrow happens when an angel warns when an angel warns Joseph that Herod is going to kill the boy. And in a dream, the angel says, get up, you got to go to Egypt, you got to go right now. And so in the middle of the night, he packs up the family, and they flee to Egypt. They go through the Sinai, where Moses brought everyone through the wilderness. Talk about sorrow. He's probably thinking to himself, how are we going to make it? I got to provide for my family. We can't even go home. You know, when I preached that series on fear, I wanted to show you a video clip of this Syrian family, refugee family that had settled in Kansas City. And as the father is describing how they had to flee from Syria to Egypt, he just begins to weep. And then on this clip, the translator begins to weep. And then you can hear the congregation, as I'm watching this video clip, as it's shown to the congregation, they all begin to weep. I mean, there's not a dry eye in it. And then the pastor looks and he says that the reason the translator began to cry, along with the father, is that the translator was from Iraq and neither of them could go home. They missed their homeland so much. You know, I think of countless people today that are in the midst of violence. They cannot go home because if they do, they're going to die or their children are going to die. You know, when I went to Guatemala, I heard these stories. I heard stories that would turn your stomachs. I heard stories about violence that just seemed unimaginable, and yet it just was every day to them. And I was so amazed that the people were so brave to tell me these stories, but yet so scared. And when I think of my travels down to Central America, I think of what Joseph went through. And when I heard of his sorrow, I think of this one village that we went to. And there's 2 stories that stand out. One is nobody spoke Spanish there. They just spoke this Mayan tongue. So when we would ask a question, it would go from English to Spanish to this Mayan language. And then when they would tell the story, it would go from Mayan to Spanish to English. It took forever. But I also remember that there were no men in the village. There were young boys and there were a few older men, but we were told that all of the men in that village had either been killed off or they ran to the city so they could not be found. And they knew that if they showed up, they would either be killed as a reprisal by the government or they would be taken and conscripted into the army. This is the sorrow that Joseph is feeling and fleeing. The joy he couldn't quite see is that Jesus and his family were safe and were welcomed as refugees in Egypt. The 6th sorrow occurs after Herod dies. And they resolve that things are safe, and so they start going back to Bethlehem. And on their way, they get another dream. And they say it is not safe to go back to Bethlehem. They've got to go farther north because Herod's son is now in power, and he is just as ruthless as his dad. And so they decide to go to Mary's hometown of Nazareth. Joseph can't even go back to his hometown. He knows no one in Nazareth. And this is Joseph's sorrow. In Nazareth, we know that he starts a trade. He raises Jesus. This is where Jesus gets known. And he starts his ministry there. This is the joy that Joseph couldn't quite see. The last sorrow we have is when Jesus is about 13 years old, and it's the last that we hear from Joseph in the scriptures. The family travels to Jerusalem for Passover, and it's a time of joy and celebration. And just about when they're ready to leave and go back to Galilee, Jesus gets separated from his parents. And for 36 hours, Joseph and Mary have no idea what Jesus is. Sarah and I have a vivid image that still haunts us. Emma was about 3 or 4, and Cora was about a toddler. And we had those turtle sandboxes, and ones that you cover the lid. And so our kids decided to play a little trick on us. They decided to hide in there and cover the lid. Well, I still remember we went out to look for our babies, and we called, and we yelled for them, and we searched every cranny, and we looked, we even had neighbors involved in the process, and we came this close to calling the police when Sarah heard these faint noises coming from that turtle sandbox. The sorrow we felt was replaced with joy when we found Emma and Cora. Joseph and Mary's sorrow was that they could not see the joy until they found Jesus in his other father's house, which was the temple. So what we have here is a man who knows the broken heart of a girl, who could not provide a proper birthing place for his son and wife, who had fear that someone was going to hurt him and his family, who experienced the sense of horror at the thought of losing his child. And you know, on the backside of every sorrow in each of these stories was joy. You know, on the backside of every sorrow for us in our life is joy. And that's the lesson here. What sorrow have you experienced? As you look back in your own life, could you see joy on the backside of it? When I think of my own life, I think of the seasons of sorrow and the seasons of joy. I grew up in Douglas, same place that Lauren and Shirley had lived, and I had 4 in my grade. Now that's not 4 in my class, that's not 4 kids sitting in the front row, that is 4 in my grade, and that's not the sorrow. I have shared with you that I was bullied when we lived there. Now maybe not on a daily basis, but on a weekly basis. And I still remember the night that we moved to Eustis, and I was starting high school, but more so no one knew me, no one knew my past. No one knew about what the miserable people like Shannon and Daniel and Doug had made my school experience. But Eustis was no bed of roses. The school was tough for me. I moved from having 4 in my grade to having 13. And 12 of them had been together since kindergarten. I was the outsider. I don't know what I would have done if it wasn't for church camp. Now for me, as I look back in those years, it wasn't much joy. I find plenty of sorrow in those experiences. But my life of sorrows does not compare to many of you. Some of you have lost a child. Some of you are working in a job that is not your ideal career. Some of you have not had a good night's sleep due to chronic pain. Some of you haven't talked to family members in years. This is sorrow. Now, as I look back in my time period, some of my best memories are anchored in those moments of sorrow. I would have never attended church camp, where I met lifelong friends and found my calling to ministry, if it wasn't for my experience in Eustis. If it wasn't for my experience in Douglas, I would not be the person I am today, fighting for the rights of women, of the marginalized, of those who don't have a voice, for those who are constantly picked on. I believe so strongly in social justice because of my experience. You know, I thank God for unanswered prayers. For through my sorrow, my wife, who is a counselor, has something to practice on. These These events have made me the father, the spouse, the pastor I am today. Obviously, I don't believe events happen for a reason. I just think God takes these experiences of pain, and sorrow, and brokenness in our lives and doesn't waste them and does something beautiful if we let Him, if we continue to trust in God. You know, there's a passage of Scripture that I love as a great definition of faith. It's found in Hebrews 11. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Hannah McCarty tells the story of a 19th century English novel set in a small Welsh town in which every year for the past 500 years the people all gather in church on Christmas Eve to pray. Now, shortly before midnight, they light candle lanterns and sing carols and hymns, and they walk down a country path several miles to an old abandoned stone shack. And there they set up this scene, complete with a manger, and in simple piety, they kneel and pray. Their hymns warm the chilly December air. Everyone in town who is capable of walking is there. There's a myth in that town, a belief that if the citizens were present on Christmas Eve, and if all are praying with perfect faith, then and only then at the stroke of midnight, the second coming will be at hand. And for 500 years, they come to that stone ruin and pray. Yet the second coming has eluded them. One of the main characters in this novel is asked, do you believe that He will come again on Christmas Eve in our town? No, he answers, shaking his head sadly. No, I don't. Then why do you come each year? He asked. Ah, he said, smiling, what if I were the only one who wasn't there when it happened? Then the author says, well, that's very little faith he has, isn't it? But it is some faith, and as it says in the New Testament, we need only have faith as small as a grain of mustard seed to get into the kingdom of heaven. And sometimes when we work with troubled youth, at-risk children, anxious teens, alcoholic or abusive or depressed, and suicidal partners, friends or clients, it is at those moments that we need that small bit of faith that kept that man coming back to that stone ruin on Christmas Eve. Just one more time, just this next time, perhaps it'll make the breakthrough then. We sometimes are called upon to work with people for whom others have abandoned all hope. Perhaps we have even come to the conclusion there's no possibility of change or growth. It's at that time that if we can find the tiniest scrap of hope, we may turn the corner, achieve a measurable gain, save someone worth saving. Please go back, my friend, just this one more time. You know, when I hear that story, I think of something that a pastor friend of mine told me. He said that he had a parishioner that caught him one Sunday and told him that he was about ready to take his life. He had no hope, but something was telling him to go to church. And he heard about sorrow and how we can have joy on the backside. And then he said to his pastor, I'm counting on it. I'm trusting it. I'm hoping there is joy on the backside of my sorrow. I want you to believe this. There is joy on the backside of sorrow. Joseph struggled to believe it, and then he realized this was the day to choose joy. He trusted God because God trusted him to raise Jesus. Put your trust and faith in God this day, and thank God for unanswered